Welcome everybody to the TIPI webinar series, and thank you for joining us for our third presentation in our Workplace Wellbeing webinar series. My name is Ashley Durham, and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement at the TIPI College of Business, and I'll be your moderator today. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and based on the U.S. Surgeon General's framework for workplace mental health and well-being, we have created a 5-part workplace well-being series where we will provide evidence-based tools for helping you be successful at work and help to promote employee well-being. This series is all in thanks to the research done by our very own TIPI faculty. I would like to thank Stephen Courtwright and all the faculty from our Management and Entrepreneurship Department for their work on this series. It is always a pleasure to partner together to bring the knowledge of our faculty to our alumni and friends across the world. Today, I'm excited to have Greg Stewart and Jennifer Nahrgang share their presentation entitled Work-Life Harmony, Providing Autonomy Over How Work is Done and Respecting Boundaries Between Work and Non-Work Time. Just some information before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box, not the chat, in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. As a reminder, all of our virtual presentations are uploaded to the college's YouTube page with closed captioning following the live webinar event. Finally, you are encouraged to stay until the end of our webinar so that we can gather your thoughts on today's presentation. Your feedback helps make our virtual programming even better, so we appreciate you taking time to answer our 4-question survey at the end of the Q&A. Now I would like to introduce both Greg and Jennifer. Greg Stewart is a professor of management and entrepreneurship who holds the Mary H. Bell Chair in Leadership at the TIPI College of Business. He serves as director of the Veterans Health Affairs Iowa City affiliate of the Primary Care Analytics team, and he has received numerous teaching awards, including the President and Provost Award for Teaching Excellence, which represents the highest level of achievement in teaching given at the University of Iowa. His teaching and research focus on increasing both productivity and happiness through the effective design and leadership of teams. Jennifer Nahrgang is the Palmer Professor of Management and Entrepreneurship at the University of Iowa. And before her career in academia, Jennifer spent 5 years working for ExxonMobil Corporation. At TIPI, she currently teaches topics related to leadership, team development, and negotiations. Jennifer enjoys working with students, executives, and organizations to help them discover ways of developing their talent to effectively lead in current and future worlds of work. Thank you both so much for being here, and I'll let you take over from here.
Thanks, Ashley. Welcome, everybody. It's fun to be with you today. I'm looking at the participant list, and it's exciting. I see a few people I know there, so hi to people that I've had for students and other people. We're excited to be able to share some of our thoughts and research and work today.
Thank you. Again, I just echo Greg's comments and thank you for being here. As Ashley mentioned, we're in this 5-part series, webinar series, and where Greg and I have been tasked is to talk about work-life harmony, and specifically autonomy and flexibility. And so we've both done research in this area. And so we're going to talk to you a little bit just about the basics of autonomy, but then dive into some of our research in terms of how can you integrate those work-life demands and how autonomy and flexibility really aids in that. So in terms of our agenda for today's session, I'm going to take the first part here and just talk about some of the basic things we know about autonomy. And then Greg has a really interesting study about empowering an empowerment paradox of leaders that will give you kind of an understanding of how do you empower others and give them that flexibility and autonomy as a leader. And then finally, I'll wrap up with some research that we've done here at TIPI as in terms of alternative work arrangements, as well as my work on side hustles around maybe some areas that you as employees or even as leaders can help your employees to craft kind of their own autonomy within the workplace. So I'll start off with just why are we even talking about this and why is this a current priority of the U.S. Surgeon General? And so if you read a lot of things about control and autonomy in work, there's a lot that employees have to say about it. And I'm sure you're probably sitting there thinking the same thing, is that, yes, I'd love more autonomy in my work. And so, nearly half of employees would actually say, I'll give up 20% raise for a greater control over how they work. There's a lot of debate right now around flexibility in work. And so more recent estimates would say 59% of employees that would say flexibility is just as important or maybe more important than salary and benefits. And then the other flip side of that is that, if you have autonomy and flexibility, that probably means you're not working for someone who's micromanaging you. And yet again, that almost 60% of employees would say they have worked for a micromanager, someone who's constantly stepping in, constantly checking up. And that has real impacts on both their morale and their productivity. And if you were to survey employers, they would say that they would agree that the companies would say less than half of the companies would agree that they do indeed have or have given their employees a high degree of autonomy, and really see that as an important area for them to consider as they consider designing work in the future. So that's kind of the problem as it is. And so I think it's important to first kind of start off with, what do we mean by autonomy? And so when we talk about autonomy, pretty something that we can all relate to, the amount of freedom and independence that I have as an individual in carrying out my work. And that may be really in three different areas. One may be how I schedule my work. The other may be in the decisions that I make. And then finally is, how do I go about performing my work? What's the means or the methods that I use to perform my work? And so when we talk about autonomy, that's really what we're talking about. And, this session, the Surgeon General sets it up as kind of autonomy and flexibility. And I think there's a great article out there right now from HBR that talks about when people say they want flexibility, a lot of what they're talking about is they want autonomy. And so they want autonomy over, how do I schedule my work? Can I make decisions? And how do I go about performing my work? And that's really what they're concentrating on. So how do you know if you have autonomy? So here are some questions to ask yourself if we were going to go and study autonomy and to see if people have autonomy in their job. We would ask them questions like, in your job, can you make decisions about how to schedule your work? Do you have the personal initiative? Can you use that initiative and judgment in how you carry out the work? And then also I can decide on my own how I go about doing my work. And so again, just a list of questions here for you to consider. What do we mean when we talk about autonomy, and how would we actually measure it if we were considering whether someone has autonomy in their job or not? So what's the importance of autonomy? So there's really two key theories within the management literature and psychology literature that talk about autonomy. And so again, the US Surgeon General really sees autonomy and flexibility as a core human need. And that is exactly how this theory sets it up. Self-determination theory would say that some fundamental needs that employees have are a fundamental need for autonomy. They have a fundamental need for competence in terms of mastering something and feeling that they are competent at something. There's also a fundamental need for relatedness, so those social relationships at work. And then we also have a fundamental need for meaningfulness in our work. And so if we experience that in work, basically the research would show overall that tends to foster some positive things like engagement, motivation, and satisfaction of employees, which results in great outcomes, both for the employee as well as the organization in terms of their performance, their persistence towards goals, and even things like creativity and innovation. So that's one of the key theories that really focuses on autonomy is this core human need that employees have. And if they can experience that, then good things happen in the workplace. The other theory that I've done more of my research on is, how do I design work in terms of the aspects or the characteristics of a job? And so job characteristics theory would say that we need to design work to have the characteristics of giving people autonomy, We also need them to have feedback in their job. We need them to use a variety of skills. We want jobs that have significance. Again, kind of going back to that meaningfulness, right? That you saw in the earlier slide. And then we also want to design work to have task identity, that I understand how my task fits into the whole, and I can see kind of the completion of my task. And so what we know from this research is that, again, it provides employees with that experience meaningfulness. So you see some of these same themes here. It also gives employees this responsibility for the outcomes. I understand from the feedback that I'm using or that I get in my job, what I'm responsible for. It gives me knowledge of my results. And again, for the organization as well as for the employee, it results in good things: higher performance, higher job satisfaction, and lower turnover. So, this would be kind of the basics of autonomy. I think it sets up well in terms of why we need autonomy, why it's important. And so I'm going to throw it over to Greg here, and he's going to talk a little bit about, well, if I'm a leader, then how do I empower others to have that autonomy? And so I will turn it over to Greg.
Thanks, Jennifer. And, as Jennifer's shared, we know really pretty clearly that autonomy is beneficial. We're all happier when we have autonomy, and we're more productive generally when we have autonomy, but we know that it doesn't always happen. In fact, as the statistics that Jennifer showed earlier illustrated, there's a lot of people that want more autonomy. So how do we get that? One of the ideas that we often talk about is the notion of empowering leadership, where we're going to have leaders that go out and empower others or give them autonomy. And if we define empowering leadership here, it's this granting of power or the authority to do certain things. So it's delegation maybe, but it goes beyond that to allow people to set their own course. And, this really comes from an innate drive that we all have to have autonomy in our lives, to be able to make our own decisions. And in fact, if you look at why leadership fails most of the time, it's because we're trying to take away somebody's autonomy. But it's really hard to give autonomy to people. And so we want to talk about why it's difficult for a couple of minutes, and then, what are some practices? So as the next slide that I have here shows, there's this thing that's kind of called the empowerment paradox. And I first got to see this up close multiple decades ago when I was working on my dissertation. So I was a young graduate student working on my PhD dissertation, and I was doing research in a hotel. And I was looking at leadership in the hotel and how it worked, and I was doing training with the employees. And I was sitting there with a group of middle managers, and we were having a great discussion about leadership. And their focus of the discussion turned, and they're like, we know a lot of things that would make this place better. We're kind of in the middle of it all here. We see things, and we know exactly how we would make things better here. But those idiot leaders above us, they won't listen to us. They tend to ignore us, and they think that we're not very smart. They think that we're not, smart enough, motivated enough to give input here. And as we went on and we were talking about that, we found it kind of interesting. Then we were talking about the people that they lead. And they're like, well, those people that are below us in this organization, we would like to empower them. We would like to give them more autonomy. But those people are not that bright. They're not very motivated. The more we give them autonomy, the more they slack off, the more they mess up. We just can't give them more autonomy. And so I'm kind of thinking this is an interesting organization, and obviously, they've got some issues going here. But as I was doing training, I met with the other groups too. And this is a little simplified example, but when I met with the top leadership, I'm like, well, what's going on here? And they're like, we could make this place a lot better, but those middle level managers below us, they won't take on more responsibility. We would like to give them autonomy, but they're not bright enough and they're not motivated enough to do it. And so, we know how to do things, but these people below us, they don't deserve and they can't deal with autonomy. And then I went and I did training with the lowest level kind of people in the organization. And I'm like, what's going on here? And they said, we are the really front line, we interact with the customers the most, we could fix this place. We know a lot of things that would make it better, but those stupid, idiotic middle managers above us, they won't listen to us. They won't take any of our input. And so that began me thinking about what I've called over the years the empowerment paradox. And this is just an example of the empowerment paradox, where leaders often think, I would love to give you more autonomy, but you're not motivated and capable of dealing with it. And at the same time, the people who work for them are saying things like, I can do more. I can help you. Give me flexibility and I will make things better. And the ironic thing about this is no matter where you ask in the organization, kind of in hierarchical levels, you get that same response. If you're asking people, kind of in the entry level, they're always giving you a very similar response to the people more up in the hierarchy. And there just seems to be this paradox of everybody feeling like they need more autonomy, but the people that they supervise are not able and kind of willing to take on more work. So we did this, and the next slide will show where we did the study actually in a healthcare setting. And these are some actual results that came about as we looked at medical teams. So in the middle, the black circle there, we have the doctor of these teams. And these teams are formed by a doctor, what we call a nurse care manager, who's an RN, by a clinical associate up in the top right, who is generally an LPN on the team. The upper left is a clerk that works with them. And the neighbors are people like pharmacists or dietitians that work with these teams. And as we were talking and doing these studies, we were trying to figure out, what made functional teams. And we found this empowerment paradox really clearly. So the black is what the theme that we heard most often from the doctors who are the providers. They said, I want to work with the neighbors, but wonder how they can do more when they're not even doing the basic stuff. I can't delegate more because people below me that I want to push things down to just don't do it. Now, it's interesting, if you look around, the neighbors are saying, hey, I can assist you. I can do a lot more for you. You're just not allowing me to do it. You go up to the clerical associates and they're like, you can help and you can make things better here. If you understand that I have some skills and I can do a lot more things than you're allowing me to do. The LPNs are like, I can help with intake assessments. I can do a lot of things, but when you jump in to assist the nurse care manager and clerical associates, I can do this. I can help you in many ways. And the nurse care manager, again, is saying something very differently. I can work independently. And so this is just a really clear example of this notion of the empowerment paradox, where each of us wants to be empowered, but when we become the leader, we tend to think that other people are not capable or motivated enough to have that autonomy in their own life. And it's just something about the nature of how things get done. So how do we do this? What are some things that we can do better? Well, there's this idea of empowering leadership to get better at it. We kind of have these three things that we should do. We need to learn skills to get through coaching, informing. We need to know how to do it. And then we've got to be able to share this responsibility, authority. And then when leaders do it, we've got to reward them and recognize that and those accomplishments that get there. And leaders have to go through this process. We went into, again, the study that I showed you before was done in the VA. And so we sat down with doctors and talked about, why aren't you giving more autonomy to people? And we gathered a lot of really interesting data. Some of it was because they were scared to do it. They were scared to empower others to give autonomy in the medical setting because ultimately they were legally responsible and liable for the care that they gave. Sometimes they were scared to give autonomy to people because they felt that they were the one that was most critical for the care, and they didn't want anything to slip through the cracks because they wanted to provide really high care. Well, what we found is those people who are thinking that they can do it all are actually messing up, if you will, because they weren't very good at keeping all the balls balancing as they needed to. So how do we do this? Another kind of framework we get to is something we call granting and claiming. And when we look at leadership, there's this process, kind of a dance, if you will, of granting and claiming. And in this case, we can think about granting and claiming in terms of autonomy. Followers can try and claim some more autonomy, but they're only going to be able to keep doing that and to exercise autonomy if the leaders grant them that autonomy. At the same time, leaders can grant autonomy and they can ask followers to do it, but it only works when the followers step in and actually claim some more of that autonomy. And so there has to be this kind of dance of leadership where over a period of time, we kind of have a process of verbal statements and nonverbal actions that are building this cycle where leaders are granting autonomy and the people who work for them are claiming more autonomy, and it builds, and it's very circular in the way that it does. And so what are some very specific activities that leaders can do? Let me just share a couple of 3 thoughts about what leaders can do to help build autonomy of others. So this portion here is kind of what can you do to lead others and give them autonomy? And then Jennifer's going to come back and talk for a minute about how can you craft more autonomy into the job when you're not the leader. But let's focus for just a minute on what leaders can do to give more autonomy. One is what we call calculated withdrawal of direction. So we know from a lot of research, and most of you would know from your own practical experience, if a leader walks in and says, you have autonomy, great, go do it, things aren't going to go very well with that immediate drop off. The granting and claiming process hasn't worked, and the people who are all of a sudden granted autonomy feel like they're hung out to dry and they don't have skills. But this dance of granting and claiming goes over a longer period of time where leaders have to calculatively withdraw some of the direction in their certain areas. So rather than walk in and say, hey, you're perfectly autonomous, good luck, they have to come to some specific areas and say, okay, here's an area where I'm going to give you more freedom, and then allow the employees to do that kind of at pieces at a time. Because all at once is just going to fail. But good leaders pick certain activities where they're going to empower more and allow more autonomy and do those kind of in a linear fashion, if you will, where it rolls out slowly over time. I think the second thing that we know good leaders have to do is allow for failure. As we grant autonomy, we have to understand that they may not do it the way that we do it. And in fact, they're likely to fail. And if they fail and we step in and immediately as a leader take that back and suck the autonomy out, look what's just happened. They tried to claim a little autonomy. We didn't grant that as leaders. And we all of a sudden now have a negative spiral where they're like, well, why should I even try? Because it's not worth it. Once it doesn't go the way this leader wants it to, they're going to suck my autonomy back. And so leaders have to really think about the trade-off. Obviously, if the follower is exercising autonomy in a way that's dangerous, in a medical setting or something like that, they need to step in. But oftentimes, letting them fail may be the best thing that the leader can do, and supporting them and working with them through it, because they're going to learn from that, but also that enrichment of the autonomy in their life is worth it. The value that you get out of allowing somebody to grow as a follower and to exercise more autonomy is probably going to come back and return more to you than if they would have done it the way you thought it should be done at the beginning. Another thing that good leaders do is they ask a lot of questions. Rather than giving direction about you go do this, you go do that, they're like, well, why did you do it that way? What are you thinking about this in the future? And those questions allow people to exercise their autonomy, but also do it in a directed way. And so good leadership to build autonomy is often question-based rather than directive-based. As the kind of we talked about before, here we need to reinforce some small improvements. So when somebody takes on a little bit of autonomy, reinforce that with these verbal statements. thanks for doing that. I'm glad you took initiative to do that. And again, it may not be perfect, but slowly over time, looking for the positive and being really, really careful not to jump back in and pull that autonomy back when things don't go what you might initially want them to. The other part of developing autonomy is teamwork. A lot of people may feel reticent to jump in and have a lot of autonomy first by themselves. But as a member of a high functioning team, we find that people in the workplace are often more likely to want to develop and to accept autonomy. And so kind of the other thing that we would find leaders do that is very effective is to empower teams and let people work together. So those are a few ideas of some things that leaders can do to overcome this empowerment paradox. I think the first step is just realizing when you're a leader, you probably have a bias thinking you need more autonomy, but others don't. And you're going to have to fight about that or fight with that internally. And these are some of the steps of things that you can do. Let's jump back to Jennifer, who's going to share with us some more ideas about how you might craft autonomy into the jobs that you have.
All right. I just have one other thing to add. I think, as I'm thinking about this, when I think about my work with doctoral students and giving them autonomy and things like that, I think it's really also important to be clear here that as a leader, you're also providing them the overall goal and the overall direction. So that doesn't go away when you give autonomy. They still know what you're aiming for. You still set those expectations, but you're allowing them the freedom and the discretion to meet that goal in a different way than maybe you would have gone about it. And so I think that's really important, is that you're not losing sight of the fact that there still are expectations, there still are goals that need to be met, but they're able to meet them in a way that's most helpful to them. So I know some people are putting some things in the Q&A, and I appreciate that. It looks like Greg's typing out an answer, and I know I answered one earlier. So feel free, again, to kind of jump in if you've got questions about what we're going through. So last thing that we want to talk about today is really, how do I craft autonomy, both as an employee, and then maybe what are some ways that employees are gaining autonomy that I need to consider as a leader. So one of the things that I have recently been studying is side hustles, which is basically any sort of income generating work that's performed on the side of a full-time job. And it's estimated that almost 30% of US workers, and certainly millions more worldwide, will adopt some form of side hustle. In the past, we may have thought about that as a second job, or maybe moonlighting and things like that. But in today's kind of gig economy, we often talk about it as side hustles, or it's known as side hustles. And what we found about studying this is that you may be asking, well, why am I concerned about this? And I'll talk about that because what we find is really one of the key features of side hustles is that they give people autonomy. And so I think it's important, and that's one of the reasons why they pursue them, is because of the autonomy. So here's some kind of key takeaways from our research on side hustles. What we've really found is, again, what you work on matters, why people pursue side hustles matters, and then obviously as an employee and both as a supervisor of people that maybe have side hustles, there's some tensions that need to be managed in terms of how it's worked on. So what you work on matters. Again, this is, what we have found, not surprisingly, is that workers feel empowered when their side hustle gives them things like what I talked about earlier: autonomy, identity, feedback, significance, and skill variety. And here's a graph from some of our research that shows kind of how, in this same survey, how people's side hustle met up with those characteristics versus their full-time work. And you can see, in the very over on the very far left, that obviously side hustles are much higher in autonomy than full-time work. And so that's one of the key features of side hustles, is that they give people autonomy and they really enjoy that autonomy. Some of the other things are similar, but autonomy and identity really tend to be kind of the distinguishing factors of side hustles. The other thing we have learned is that why people work on side hustles matter. And so, you know, I am always cognizant of the fact that the number one reason that people work on side hustles is for pay. And so that's a key reason for pursuit of side hustles. But there's also other reasons. Again, they want variety or autonomy. So that's why the second most popular reason or prevalent reason of why people seek out side hustles. They may also want security or stability. And then finally, some people seek them out because of the relationships that they may form, or maybe I'm doing something helpful that's altruistic for other people in my side hustle. So why you work on it matters. And then the last part then is if I'm going to pursue this because it gives me autonomy, then what are some things I need to think about? And so our research would basically say, again, how you work on it matters, and that there are key tensions to manage. And so some of those, I think it's important to think about from a manager perspective. Is the key question we always get is, how is this going to take away from different aspects of my full-time job? And what we have found is that when people feel empowered from their side hustles, they really are put into this positive emotional state that ends up enhancing full-time work performance. And so there actually are some benefits to the full-time job. You know, I've surveyed people and talked to people. There was a woman that she had a cookie baking business. And so she really found this as this creative outlet for her and really enjoyed it, and actually found that that creativity really enhanced her full-time performance. So there are some benefits there. We also have found that diversification across side hustles will promote optimism and well-being. But you can't be, you know, we can't talk about side hustles without also saying that clearly there are tensions that need to be managed and some challenging aspects. So there is a little bit of people who have side hustles thinking back to their side hustles during full-time work. We also have some recent studies, a recent study that was just accepted for publication that basically says that, you know, because I have so much autonomy in my side hustle, that when I get pulled back to full-time work, I often feel like that autonomy has been taken away. And so I may either be very take more initiative in my full-time job, or I may also become just a little bit tough to work with. And so it's important that that full-time job gives me autonomy, so that divide between the autonomy that I enjoy in my side hustles and the autonomy in my full-time work is not as big as it once was. And then obviously for both employees performing side hustles as well as managers that maybe have employees with side hustles, it's always important to think about in terms of this work-life boundary, that working multiple jobs or working side hustles can deplete resources. It can be stressful and can also, you know, decrease your well-being. So important to kind of think about that work-life harmony as part of this when you're trying to integrate the side hustles with your full-time job, is that there can be some depletion there as well. So the last thing that I want to talk about is just a little bit in terms of how do we create flexibility. So there's a large debate, an ongoing debate, obviously right now within the different organizations, different companies, in the popular press around remote, hybrid, or in-person work. And we have a few webinars on that as well. I'm sure that Ashley would love for me to mention, but we do have some that talk about that. And so when we think about flexibility, a lot of times when we're thinking about flexibility in work, we can create flexibility in work really through three different things. One may be the type of employment relationship that we have. So it could be that I'm a freelancer and that gives me a lot of flexibility in my work. Or again, I do some sort of contract work or things like that. That can be one type of flexibility in work. The other is how I schedule my work, right? So whether I have flexible work hours, whether I can work when I want, or perhaps the 4-day work weeks obviously would be another, I guess, form of scheduling work. And then finally, where work is accomplished. And again, that's probably the biggest focus right now, are those last two, is where am I accomplishing my work and where can I schedule my work? And so I think it's important to kind of think about that, because that's top of mind for both employees and for employers as they're thinking about this autonomy and flexibility, and how can I give that to employees, and should I in remote, in hybrid, or in-person work? And so here's a little bit, I think it's important to think about, well, what are the impacts of remote work on employees? And so the literature would basically say some key things about the impact of remote work. One would be that it does increase job satisfaction. Most people are happier when they're working remotely, but they can also experience isolation. So if you go back to that original slide that I talked about when we talked about autonomy, we also talked about relatedness, right, of work and how important that is. And so there is an aspect of that that needs to be taken into account, that people can feel this professional isolation. What more people are concerned about is are people going to be productive? And the research again would show that both supervisor rated as well as objective data around high levels of productivity, that employees that work remote can maintain high levels of productivity. They also tend to have a stronger organizational commitment and less desire to leave. Again, those statistics at the very beginning around the problem, almost 60% are saying, I really value flexibility over salary, over benefits. And so if we can find a way to make that work, we may have stronger organizational commitment. And then finally, I think it's important, really, not just from an organizational perspective, but to also think about you as potentially as a supervisor. Supervisors really matter in remote work. We have some research here going on at Tippy around remote work with Beth Livingston and others that's looking at kind of remote supervision, but we do know that it matters. There's high levels of commitment, higher job satisfaction and job performance when that employee has a high quality relationship with their supervisor. So it's important to think about that in terms of remote work. But there obviously are challenges to manage with flexibility, and how do I give myself flexibility? And so one of the things that we've done here at the University of Iowa, and specifically within the Tippy College of Business, is about a year ago, there was a pilot program around kind of the return to work and different people and different work arrangements and how that was impacted. And so the dean allowed us to really wanted us to study this, and it was really helpful for us to really kind of get some data behind how is this pilot working. And here's some key challenges that we found that employees need to think about in their own, as well as supervisors, when they try to implement this flexibility in work arrangements. The first is there any redistribution of work arrangements? And so again, you can kind of see in this top graph, that gray line is basically saying that if there's more work redistribution in terms of I'm getting other people's work, then I'm more likely to turn over. And so we need to think about, if I'm giving flexible work, am I also, is there been a redistribution of work that maybe is putting more on one person and less on another? The other key piece that we found is that the fairness in work arrangements really matters. So again, you see kind of this bottom graph here, which basically says that anytime that people felt like there was more fairness and justice, whether that was in just the procedures of how we decided on fairness in the work arrangements, that really impacted and lessened turnover intentions. I'm less likely to quit the organization if I feel like there's fairness in those work arrangements. And that fairness doesn't have to be just you got this and I didn't, although we need to think about that, right? We need to think about, are all roles that have remote work, is everybody allowed to kind of apply for that? That's one thing to think about, is just kind of how the work arrangement fits with a particular job. I think it's one way to think about distributive fairness there, but also in terms of the procedures. Did everybody get to apply for the different work arrangements was one of the things that we found, as well as how well do supervisors explain why different work arrangements are appropriate for different jobs. The other things I think we have to manage is just the rules of engagement and collaboration across technology. So obviously technology plays a large role when you're working remotely or you're hybrid. I think we've become accustomed to that, but obviously there are people, that think on Zoom calls or something like that, that my engagement in my team meetings have gone down. And so we need to think about ways that we can increase the engagement. And maybe that's delegating some of the task of the meetings to employees. The other is professional isolation. I talked about that earlier. So again, I think especially as you onboard new employees that may be in remote or hybrid, how are we making those connections for them with other people that they're working with so that they don't feel isolated? And then finally, as a theme of this, obviously work-life harmony. I think one of the key things that we learned during the shutdown and everybody having to work from remote is that we really need to respect work-home boundaries as well. And so just because I'm working from home doesn't mean that I'm going to continue to just work longer or something like that. I really, as an individual, need to respect the boundaries and between my work and my home. So I think that's all that Greg and I have. And so we've got some great questions here that I will just start with.
You can take the first one, Jennifer, that's still open if you want. I think this is a nice question, and about how does autonomy apply to work outcomes, or does autonomy apply to work outcomes and outputs only, or to other soft skills like personal, professional development and career path guidance? And so let me answer in a couple of ways. Maybe one of these is right. One is, if you're asking kind of to this idea, do we want autonomy in these other areas? The absolute answer is yes. I think talking with, building on what Jennifer has been sharing with us, there's this clear sense that one of the reasons why we like these flexible working arrangements is because of the autonomy. And it gives us autonomy over multiple aspects of our life. And so there's an ability to do that in kind of every aspect of our life. We like autonomy. The other maybe thing you're driving at in this question is, should we allow them autonomy in how they interact with others? And this gets to kind of the next question that's very similar. And the answer is, yeah. When we think about autonomy and flexibility, we obviously have to have guardrails in place. We can't just tell everybody, go do your own thing totally. But if we have these shared goals and then we focus on these shared goals, we can have a lot of autonomy under how to get there. And so if we know what the outcomes we're trying to get at, and we agree on those, and particularly if the people that are working with you have had input into those, then a lot of more autonomy can be given to allow people kind of their freedom in how to get there. And, so the next question kind of, I think, builds on this too. I'd like to hear more about how we provide autonomy in prescriptive roles like teaching corrections, where there are lots of policies and procedures. I'll take teaching. If we're super directive, people aren't always learning. So we may think about this as a place where there's not a lot of autonomy. I won't go to corrections. I don't know a whole lot about that. But in terms of teaching, the more autonomy we can give the students, the more likely they are to actually learn something. Because again, it's very motivational. One of the most motivational forces that we have is autonomy. Now, tied to that is efficacy or belief that you can do it. And so as leaders, we have to give them autonomy, but we also have to build kind of their efficacy that they can do it. And help them understand the skills and the capability that they have. And part of that, again, is this directed over time, helping them get victories and do more with autonomy and build that confidence so that they spiral into that. So hopefully that answered a couple of those. I think there's one here, Jennifer, about a couple here on these gig jobs. So I'll throw this back to you.
Yeah. I do think it's important also when we're thinking, there certainly are some aspects where autonomy may not be appropriate, right? So I used to work at ExxonMobil, where safety was a key concern. So in certain aspects of your role, there may be areas where you really can't have a lot of autonomy. You know the decision that needs to be made, or you know the policy or procedure that has to happen. But I also think there's other things that maybe we haven't thought of that employees can think of in terms of, here's a small decision that if you would just let me make this, I would feel like I have more autonomy. And so even just asking where are some aspects of your role that you think you can be given more flexibility and autonomy may help in that as well. So I think this is a very fair question. The question is how do I point out to direct reports that possibly the amount of time they're spending on their side hustle is the reason for their lack of success? And that is certainly one of the things that we are currently studying here, me and my graduate students, is, again, when I have surveyed managers, I've been surprised in that most of them are more supportive of side hustles than I would have thought. But the two key things that come up is I'm supportive as long as it doesn't influence full-time performance. And the second is, and I'm also concerned about their burnout. And so I do think your concern is very well founded. And I think it's helpful then a side hustle. As I said, I think if we're talking about boundaries, I also think there need to be boundaries between full-time work and side hustles. And so I think it's important and very fair to sit down with the employee and talk to them about what expectations you have around those boundaries in terms of their side hustle. And working remotely, that's a whole another issue. Again, because you don't have, you feel like you don't have as much control over and can't see them, right? So you don't know whether they're working on that side hustle or not. But I think setting those expectations and having and trusting in that and making sure that the expectations of their performance are very clear. And then if they're not meeting those, certainly that can be pointed out. And that may be because of the side hustle, it may be because of other reasons. But I think we often go to the side hustle, and that may not be the reason, but certainly fair to point out performance detriments that may be hurting the organization. So the other question is, there's a lot of ongoing training about how to make people more included, those remote workers. How to have those employees realize that they need to participate and help manage with this task. So I think yeah, that's a great question. I guess I think about it more in terms of level of engagement, which may not be the same as feeling connected, but level of engagement, as I talked about in Zoom meetings, a lot of managers feel like people are just zoned out and they're not really listening or participating in the meeting. And so I think that's where certainly being clear that in a meeting, we're going to discuss about this, and I'm going to ask everybody to chime in, and then ensuring that you do that. I think the other is delegating parts of that agenda to other people within the meeting that are working remotely so that they feel some accountability and also maybe some autonomy in terms of handling that part of the meeting will help them to be engaged. And then I think the other part is just trying to understand and explaining. I think people always want to know the why. So why is it important that I feel connected? why is it important that I make these connections as a remote worker, and being really clear about maybe how their work impacts other people. And so developing those relationships is important, maybe one way of going about it. But I do think people need to understand kind of the why of why is it important that, like, why can't I just sit and do my job and that's all I need, right? But there are connections at work that need to be continued to be made as remote workers.
I think that one dovetails nicely to Jennifer with one of the questions that comes down a little later of other people's flexibility puts me in Zoom meetings all day. I think a lot of us can relate to that kind of question. And, I think, kind of implicit in Jennifer's answer is this sense that, autonomy is great, but there have to be some limits on it and some coordination of autonomy. And it's kind of interesting, even there's some research on levels. So if teams as a group are super empowered and they have a lot of autonomy as the team, it actually sometimes destroys the individual autonomy. That sounds kind of weird because you'd go, okay, if the team's autonomous, can't the individuals be autonomous? And the answer is, well, if the team doesn't have much autonomy, then everybody knows where you're going and they can get there on their own. But when you give the team autonomy, sometimes the team overrides the individual autonomy. And so there's a lot of little trade-offs in here. And I think a lot of the answer to this is that autonomy, to make it work, you have to have more levels of coordination, perhaps. And we have to be able to put boundaries. So if we're in Zoom meetings all the time because it's everybody else's flexibility, maybe we need to take some of that back and not feel so guilty about it. Okay, I'm available to do this on this half of the day, and give them a zone of autonomy, but maintain your own zone of autonomy too. And being able to do that in a way that balances their needs with yours, I think is valuable. And this kind of gets back to why do we do that, and how do we build that? So when we talk about autonomy in the workplace, I don't think we're ever saying everybody has complete autonomy. It's like you have autonomy, but you also have to understand how that impacts and influences other people's autonomy. And the Zoom example is great. If you have a lot of autonomy, that can negatively impact my autonomy. And getting people to understand that, and then building these relationships within teams so that Jennifer and I working together, I actually care about her as a person and understand the impacts on her autonomy. That's kind of valuable and underlying the way that we have to balance each of our needs.
I do think one of the things that we have found, there's a lot of talk out there about the benefits of hybrid work, right? We get the best of both worlds, right? But I think hybrid work really creates a lot of complications where you've got people in the office that are sitting in Zoom meetings. And so then they're wondering, why am I even here? Or alternatively, you've got people constantly on Zoom because everybody else is working remotely. And so to Greg's point, I think you have to draw some boundaries around that. That may be day boundaries. So maybe on Wednesdays, we can't have Zoom calls. Or maybe there are particular meetings or aspects that we really do need people into the office. And so I think our department's a great example. Greg leads our department. And there are some faculty meetings where he says, this is going to be in person, right? And if I can't make it, I can't make it, right? But I'm respectful of the fact that he's basically said this is going to be in person. And then there are some where we would say, it's okay if we do this remotely. So I do think you've got to draw those boundaries as well. So some other questions. In terms of the research or opinions on supervisors working from home while their employees are in the office, I have not. I don't know of any research that's looked at that. It's an interesting question.
I'll give you an example that kind of relates to this. I had a student that did a PhD dissertation on this a while back, looking at different configurations, and it kind of relates to this. What he found in here is if you have one person that is away and the rest of the team is together physically, it's really hard for the remote person to engage and to be a leader. If everybody were equally dispersed, they can do that. But the fact that there's this co-located group that is outside of the leader's boundaries, this research would suggest that they're going to have a really hard time being seen as credible and being part of that team. So I would say, from the research that we have, that would be a really dangerous situation to have a remote supervisor when everybody else is actually present, because that person's going to be discounted. And so, I don't have a solution for that other than to say, I would rethink that arrangement if you can. Again, maybe it's not all the time, but we would have really clear evidence that would suggest that it's going to be hard for that leader and they'll probably be marginalized.
A couple of other questions. One of the questions is how do you give autonomy but not let your goals deviate or take back autonomy if it's deviating from the goal? I do think that's why it's really important to be really clear on what the expectations are and if those are met. To Greg's point earlier around kind of, you've got to give kind of this measured withdrawal, right? So I think that in building that over time will help, not giving people full autonomy and then taking it back, but have they shown that they can handle those decisions that you're empowering them to make? The other would be to take pilot projects, right? To pilot some level and be really clear, we're going to pilot this for the next 3 months, and then we're going to reevaluate. I think that's another way to avoid this situation to where you've given autonomy and then maybe it hasn't worked out as well, because that at the end of that pilot period, you can also adjust as well as, and that may not mean take it fully back, but basically say, this isn't really working the way I intended. And so maybe we need to make some adjustments here. So that would be one thing to think about.
I'll take a couple of more of these. One of them, gets at us faculty have high autonomy and flexibility. But how do we motivate them to do things in department activities? So as Jennifer said, I think about this a lot. And then, the next one, how a employee has high autonomy, but they're bored. What happens? And I would say, again, autonomy has to come around this shared vision. And if you have an employee has a lot of autonomy, but they're bored, then they probably need a goal to work to, something to motivate them and to engage them, and faculty the same thing. One of the research findings, we know that, rewards are motivational, but something that's as powerful or maybe more motivational is the pull of the group. When you're a member of a high performing team that's cohesive and you have close relationships, then people are going to have autonomy, but they're not going to want to let their peers down. And so to the degree you can build that cohesive goal and this kind of gets around autonomy to do things, but we're all engaged around this common goal, we're going to be much more likely to succeed and to use our autonomy in ways that benefit everybody else. All right, Ashley's kicking me off, and Jennifer, I think she's ready to wrap it up. We're up against time. These are always such great discussions. We'd love to do them more, but everybody's got to go back to work. We only have so much autonomy, I guess.
Only so much today. Well, thank you both. I certainly learned a lot. I always learn something on these webinars, which is why I enjoy them so much. And thank you, Greg and Jennifer, and thank you everyone for attending the Tippy Workplace Wellbeing webinar presentation today. When the event ends in just a moment, you'll see that 4-question survey. We'd be grateful if you could share your thoughts and help us make our virtual programming even better. On behalf of the Tippy College of Business, thank you for joining us today. And as always, go Hawks.
Thanks, everyone.